I was 75 years old when I sat in that quiet office and gave everything away. Not because I was weak, not because I was confused, and certainly not because I didn't understand what I was doing. But that day, everyone in that room believed I was a foolish old woman making the worst mistake of her life. The walls were beige, the kind of color meant to calm people down. The air smelled faintly of old paper, coffee that had gone cold, and something metallic, like fear. My lawyer sat across from me, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He had been practicing law for over 40 years, and I could see it in his eyes. He had never seen anything like this. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, leaning forward, lowering his voice as if he were speaking to a child, "I need you to understand something very clearly. If you sign these documents, you will walk away with nothing. No house, no savings, no pension, nothing." I nodded. I had heard him the first 5 times. Across the table, my husband, soon to be my ex-husband, sat stiffly in his chair. Harold Carter, 81 years old, tall, proud, and convinced that the world still bent to his will. He avoided my eyes not out of shame, but out of impatience. He wanted this over with. After 52 years of marriage, he wanted to erase me like an old receipt stuffed in his wallet. "You don't have to do this," my lawyer continued. "We can fight. The law is on your side. After this many years of marriage, you're entitled to—" "I know what I'm entitled to," I interrupted calmly. My voice surprised even me. It didn't shake, it didn't crack, it was steady, like I had already crossed some invisible line. Harold finally looked at me then. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, confusion, maybe even suspicion. But it passed quickly. He smiled, a small, satisfied smile. He thought he had won. For weeks, everyone had been telling me the same thing. My daughter cried on the phone. My sister stopped speaking to me. Even the clerk at the courthouse had looked at me with pity when she saw the paperwork. "You've been married longer than I've been alive," she said. "Are you sure about this?" Yes, I was sure. But no one knew why, and that was the point. Harold and I had met when I was 23 years old. I was young, hopeful, and foolish in the way only young people can be. He was 30, charming, confident, already working at a firm downtown. He wore suits that smelled like aftershave and ambition. When he spoke, people listened. I mistook that for strength. Our marriage, at least in the beginning, looked perfect from the outside. We bought a modest home. I taught elementary school. He climbed the corporate ladder. We had 2 children, family dinners, holidays, photographs smiling stiffly at the camera. But behind closed doors, something else grew. Control. It started small. Questions about where I went, comments about what I wore, jokes that cut just a little too deep. And slowly, without me realizing it, my life became smaller while his became larger. When I stopped teaching to raise the children, he said it was our decision. When all the accounts were moved into his name, he said it was simpler. When he told me not to worry about money, that he'd handle it, I believed him. For decades I believed him. By the time I realized how completely dependent I had become, I was already trapped, not by law, but by fear. Fear of starting over, fear of being alone, fear of admitting that I had given my life to someone who saw me as replaceable. But time does something strange to fear. It dulls it. And one day, fear is replaced by something far more dangerous. Clarity. The affair came when I was 72. I didn't find lipstick on his collar or messages on his phone. No. Harold was too careful for that. I found the bank statement, a monthly transfer, small enough to go unnoticed at first, regular enough to become familiar. I asked him about it at dinner, my voice casual. "Oh, that?" he said, not looking up from his plate. "Just helping someone out." Someone. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m, I went to the guest room and opened the old filing cabinet Harold had forgotten about. It still held papers from decades ago, documents he assumed I'd never touch. That's when I started to see the truth. Accounts I didn't recognize, assets I had never been told about. A web of financial decisions made quietly, deliberately, over years. And then, tucked behind a manila folder, I found the letters. Not emails, not texts, handwritten letters, from a woman named Claire, She was 46 years old. The divorce followed quickly after that, not because he was ashamed, but because he was ready. He had already prepared. When he told me he wanted a divorce, his tone was businesslike, as if he were canceling a subscription he no longer used. "I'll make it easy for you," he said. "You can stay with your daughter. I'll cover your expenses for a few months." I remember looking at him, really looking at him, and realizing something that shocked me. He was afraid, not of losing me, but of losing control of the story. So when I agreed to the divorce without protest, when I told him I wanted nothing, when I said I didn't want lawyers fighting over assets, he relaxed. That was his first mistake. My lawyer didn't understand. No one did. But long before I ever sat in that beige office, long before I ever picked up the pen to sign those papers, I had already begun my plan. A plan built on patience, on silence, on letting people believe exactly what they wanted to believe. At 75, I had learned something Harold never had. The most powerful moves are the ones no one sees coming, and sometimes the only way to win is to walk away with nothing. No one ever tells you how loud silence can become. In the weeks after Harold asked for the divorce, the house felt different. Not emptier, just sharper. Every sound stood out. The ticking of the clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator at night, even the way the floorboards creaked beneath his steps, as if the house itself was keeping a record of where he went and when. Harold behaved as though nothing had changed. He still sat in his favorite chair, still complained about the news, still asked what was for dinner even though he'd already told me he was leaving. It was as if he believed the words "I want a divorce" were enough to erase 52 years. I played my part well. I nodded when he spoke. I kept my eyes down. I moved slowly, deliberately, like a woman defeated by age and circumstance. Men like Harold underestimate silence. They mistake it for surrender, but silence can be a workshop. And while Harold believed I was falling apart, I was working. The first thing I did was stop reacting. No arguments, no accusations, no tears. When he told our children, I let him control the narrative. He said the marriage had run its course. He said we had grown apart. He even said he would take care of me. I let him say all of it. My daughter called me later, furious. "Mom, why aren't you fighting him?" "I'm tired," I said softly. That answer satisfied her in a way the truth never could. People expect old women to be tired. The second thing I did was listen. Harold had grown careless over the years. Not sloppy, but confident. He spoke freely now, especially on the phone. He assumed I wasn't paying attention, or worse, that I didn't understand. He talked about investments, about meetings, about Claire. Yes, I knew her name now. Claire wasn't just a woman he was helping. She wasn't some harmless distraction. She was part of his future, a future he had already begun building, financially, legally, emotionally, while still married to me. And that future depended on one thing: me disappearing quietly. I began keeping a notebook. Nothing dramatic, just a small black notebook I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the guest room. I wrote dates, times, snippets of conversation. Transfer finalized, trust mentioned again, Claire wants reassurance. I wrote everything down, not because I planned to confront him, but because memory fades. Paper does not. At night, after Harold fell asleep, I returned to the filing cabinet, the one he thought was obsolete, the one he believed held nothing of value. Men like Harold archive their sins carefully. There were tax documents from years ago, statements from banks I didn't recognize, correspondence from financial advisors who had never once included my name. And then there was the trust. It wasn't new. That was the part that mattered. The trust had been established 18 years earlier, during what Harold had called a good year, a year when we'd paid off the mortgage, a year when I'd suggested we finally travel. Instead, he had moved assets he claimed didn't exist. I took nothing, not a single document. I didn't photograph them, didn't copy them, didn't confront him. People think preparation means gathering evidence aggressively, but that's not always true. Sometimes preparation means understanding the shape of the battlefield. I needed to know what Harold believed was hidden, what he believed was safe, what he believed I would never find, because those beliefs were his weakness. The third thing I did was consult someone Harold would never suspect. I didn't go to a divorce attorney, not at first. That would have alarmed him. He was watching my movements now, gauging whether I would suddenly grow a spine. Instead, I visited an old friend. Margaret and I had taught together decades earlier. She had retired from education and gone back to school in her 60s to study accounting. People thought she was eccentric for it. I thought she was brave. We met for coffee, and I told her everything. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts. She listened without interruption, stirring her tea slowly, her face unreadable. When I finished, she looked at me and said something that changed everything. "He's not planning for divorce," she said. "He's planning for insulation." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He's not just leaving you. He's protecting himself. From taxes, from claims, from exposure. That trust? It's not just for Claire. It's for him." I felt something settle in my chest, a confirmation. "So what do?" I asked. Margaret studied me for a long moment. "First," she said, "you stop thinking like a wife. Second, you stop thinking like a victim. And third, you let him underestimate you." Harold's lawyer called a week later. He wanted to keep things amicable. He suggested a simple agreement, no drawn-out litigation, no unpleasantness. I agreed immediately. That surprised him. It surprised Harold even more. That night Harold poured himself a drink, something he only did when he felt victorious. "You're handling this well," he said casually. "Not many women would." I smiled faintly. "I suppose I don't have much choice." That answer pleased him. What I didn't say was that I had already made the most important choice of my life. I had chosen timing. The thing about divorce, especially late-life divorce, is that everyone assumes it's about money. It isn't. It's about leverage. Harold believed the leverage was his income, his assets, his lawyers. He believed I had nothing, no job, no savings, no fight left in me. What he didn't understand was that leverage doesn't always come from what you own. Sometimes it comes from what the other person is trying to hide. And Harold was hiding something much larger than an affair. The trust documents told part of the story, but not all of it. Over several nights, I pieced together a pattern. Assets moved shortly before tax deadlines. Funds shifted through layers of accounts, small withdrawals that added up over time. This wasn't a man preparing to share his wealth with a new wife. This was a man preparing for scrutiny. And that meant one thing. Someone, somewhere, could eventually come asking questions. Questions he needed me far away from. That was when I made my most difficult decision. I decided to walk away completely. No alimony, no property, no pension. Because the moment I fought him for money was the moment his defenses would rise, the moment lawyers would dig deeper, the moment he would begin protecting himself aggressively. And I needed him comfortable, careless, confident. I needed him to believe the story he was telling everyone else, that I was an old woman giving up because she had no strength left. The divorce paperwork arrived 2 weeks later. Harold slid it across the table toward me, his hand steady, his face carefully neutral. "You should have your lawyer look at it," he said. "I will," I replied, and I did. My lawyer was kind, thorough, alarmed. He went through every clause, every paragraph, his concern growing with each page. "This leaves you exposed," he said. "Completely." I nodded. "You understand that if you sign this, there's no going back?" "I understand." He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Why are you doing this?" I met his eyes for the first time since the meeting began. "Because," I said, "this isn't the end of the story." He didn't understand that either. But he would, eventually. At home, Harold began making plans openly. He talked about selling the house, about moving closer to Claire, about starting fresh. He even asked me one evening what I planned to do. "I'll manage," I said. He smiled. "You always did." That smile held no warmth, only relief. Relief that I wasn't going to make this hard. Relief that I was disappearing exactly as he hoped. The night before I signed the documents, I couldn't sleep, not because I doubted my plan, but because walking away with nothing is not an act of weakness. It's an act of trust. Trust in yourself. Trust in timing. Trust that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the girl I once was. 23 years old. In love. Certain that security came from being chosen. At 75, I finally understood something she never could. Security comes from knowing when to let go. When I signed the papers the next day, my hand didn't shake. Harold exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for months. My lawyer looked like he wanted to stop me, but I signed, and in that moment Harold believed he had won everything. What he didn't know was that I had just given him exactly what he wanted, and that was when my plan truly began to work. The morning after I signed the divorce papers, I woke up before sunrise. For the first time in decades, there was no weight on my chest telling me what I needed to do for someone else. No schedule to follow, no mood to manage, no expectations to meet. Just quiet. That kind of quiet can be terrifying if you're not ready for it. But I was. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the small kitchen table, the one Harold never liked because it reminded him of simpler times. Outside, the neighborhood was still asleep. Lawns trimmed too perfectly, flags hanging motionless, houses full of people who believed they knew their spouses. I smiled at that thought. People believe what they want to believe, and Harold wanted to believe I was finished. After the divorce became official, Harold changed overnight. Not emotionally, he had been checked out for years, but structurally. His routines shifted. His phone calls became louder, more confident. He no longer lowered his voice when discussing finances. He no longer closed doors carefully. He believed privacy was no longer necessary. I moved out quietly 2 weeks later. No arguments, no drama, no last-minute demands. I packed only clothes, personal items, and a few old photographs. I left the furniture, the dishes, even the wedding china his mother had given us. When Harold saw the nearly empty room, he nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "This makes things easier." "Yes," I replied, "it does." He had no idea how true that was. I moved into a small rental apartment on the edge of town. Nothing special. 1 bedroom, thin walls, old carpet. To Harold, it looked like proof of my downfall. To me, it was camouflage. People don't look closely at women they think are struggling. They offer pity, they lower expectations, they stop asking questions. Invisibility is a gift if you know how to use it. The first call came 3 weeks later. It was from a man named Richard Bell. He introduced himself as a compliance consultant. That phrase alone told me everything. "I'm calling regarding some historical financial structures connected to your former husband," he said carefully. "We're conducting a routine review. Routine reviews don't involve calling ex-wives." "I'm not sure how I can help," I said honestly. "That's quite all right," he replied. "At this time, we're just gathering context." Context. They already knew something, and Harold didn't know they knew. After the call, I sat very still. This was the moment Margaret had warned me about, when something buried too deeply begins to push back. I didn't call Harold, didn't alert him, didn't ask questions. I waited. 2 days later, another call came, this one from a woman, polite, professional. Her tone was friendly in the way only trained voices are. She asked about dates, about relocations, about whether I had ever been asked to sign documents I didn't understand. I answered truthfully and carefully. The truth is powerful when delivered calmly. What Harold never understood was this: you can move money, you can move assets, but you can't erase patterns. Over decades, Harold had built a life that depended on one assumption, that no one would ever look too closely, especially not me. Meanwhile, Harold was enjoying his freedom. I heard through our son that he was planning a trip, that he and Claire were looking at properties, that he'd been boasting about starting fresh. Fresh starts are expensive, and they attract attention. A month after the divorce, Harold called me for the first time. His voice was different, tight. "Did anyone contact you?" he asked casually. "No," I said. That was true, depending on how you defined contact. He paused. "Just checking." "About what?" I asked. "Nothing," he said too quickly. "Just routine things." After we hung up, I laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in years, because Harold was scared, and fear makes people sloppy. I began receiving mail that wasn't meant for me, old accounts updating addresses too late, notifications sent automatically, system-generated letters that didn't know the marriage was over. Each envelope told a story, and each story confirmed what I already knew. Harold had built his empire on complexity. Too many layers, too many shadows, too many assumptions that no one would ever untangle it. But systems are designed to notice anomalies, and Harold had become an anomaly. One afternoon, Margaret visited me. She sat on the edge of my couch, scanning my small apartment, nodding approvingly. Still invisible, she said. For now. She grew serious. They're circling. I know. You ready? I took a deep breath. I've been ready for years. What I hadn't told Margaret, what I hadn't told anyone, was the final piece of the puzzle. Years earlier, long before the affair, long before the divorce, Harold had asked me to sign something. He'd said it was routine, something about protecting assets, something about estate planning. I had trusted him then, but that document had stayed with me. And now, decades later, it was about to matter. Because while Harold thought I had given everything away, there was one thing he could never take: my name. By the end of the second month, Harold stopped sleeping well. I could hear it in his voice when he called our son, the irritability, the defensiveness, the subtle panic beneath his confidence. He had started answering questions. That was his second mistake. One evening, as I sat alone eating dinner, my phone rang again. This time the caller ID was blocked. "Mrs. Carter," a voice said, firm but respectful. "This call may feel unexpected, but it's important." I listened. "We're reviewing a series of financial arrangements that intersect with your former marriage. Your cooperation could be helpful." "Helpful to whom?" I asked. There was a pause. "To the truth," the voice said. I smiled. "Then I'll help," I replied. That night I slept deeply, not because everything was resolved, but because the machinery had started moving, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. Harold still believed I was the woman who walked away with nothing. He still believed the story he told himself. But stories have endings, and his was already being written without his permission. There is a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when power begins to shift. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make noise. It simply changes hands while everyone else is still looking the other way. For Harold, that moment came on a Tuesday morning. He didn't know it yet. I was making oatmeal when the phone rang. This time it wasn't blocked. It was Harold. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello?" His voice came through strained, wrapped in an effort to sound normal. Did you get any mail from the bank recently?" I stirred the pot slowly. "Which bank?" There was a pause, too long. "Just any bank," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "Why?" Another pause. I could almost hear the gears turning, calculating how much to say without revealing too much. "Sometimes things get sent to the wrong address," he muttered. "That's all." "Ah," I said. "That happens." We hung up shortly after. I sat down at the table and smiled to myself, because when people start asking vague questions, it means they're afraid of specific answers. Within days, Harold's world began tightening. Not dramatically, not publicly, administratively. His accounts took longer to process transactions. Advisors stopped returning calls immediately. Meetings were postponed pending review. Those are the kinds of delays that feel harmless, until they aren't. Harold had built his confidence on access, on being able to move money freely, quietly, efficiently. Now doors were closing without explanation. Our son called me that weekend. "Dad's stressed," he said. "He's snapping at everyone." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied. "You sure you're okay, Mom?" he asked gently. "This can't be easy for you." I looked around my small apartment, the chipped mug in my hand, the afternoon sunlight on the carpet. "I'm fine," I said truthfully. That confused him. People expect devastation after divorce, especially at my age. What they don't expect is peace. The first official letter arrived the following week. It was addressed to Harold, but sent to me. A mistake, perhaps, or perhaps not. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The return address told me enough. Harold arrived at my apartment that evening unannounced. That alone told me how shaken he was. He stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, eyes scanning the space as if expecting to find evidence of betrayal hidden in plain sight. "Why didn't you forward my mail?" he demanded. "I didn't open it," I said evenly. "It didn't feel right." His jaw tightened. "Did you talk to anyone?" he asked. "About what?" I asked. His eyes flicked away. "About me." I met his gaze. "No," I said. That answer finally seemed to calm him, because Harold believed the danger came from exposure. He never considered that truth didn't need me to speak loudly. It was already speaking for itself. The calls increased after that, not to me, but around me, old acquaintances reaching out, former colleagues asking how I was holding up. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly interested in my well-being. Concern spreads quickly when rumors begin. And something was circulating. Margaret called one evening. "They've escalated," she said. "Who?" "Everyone." She explained carefully. Investigations had layers. Reviews led to audits. Audits led to deeper questions. "Harold's history is complicated," she said, "and complexity attracts attention." "I know," I replied. "You're positioned well," she continued, "but be careful. He may try to control the narrative again." I laughed softly. "That's his favorite thing." Harold tried exactly that 2 days later. He invited our children to dinner, not together, separately. He told them stories, carefully crafted ones, about misunderstandings, about overzealous reviewers, about people misinterpreting old decisions, and then inevitably he mentioned me. "She doesn't really understand how these things work," he said gently. "At her age, it's a powerful shield if you believe it makes you invisible." Our daughter called me afterward upset. "Dad says there might be trouble," she said. "Legal trouble." I waited. "He thinks you might have said something without realizing it." There it was, the beginning of the blame. "I told the truth," I said simply. She hesitated. "But did you talk to anyone?" "Yes," I said. Silence. "Mom, I didn't lie," I continued. "And I didn't exaggerate." I answered questions. Questions from who? People doing their jobs. That unsettled her. People like certainty. They like clear villains and victims. Truth exists in the space between. The pressure began to show on Harold physically. He lost weight. His hands trembled slightly when he reached for his glass. His voice cracked once, briefly, during a call with our son. He was unraveling, not because he was guilty, though he was, but because he was no longer in control. One afternoon, I received another call. This one was different, direct. "We'd like to schedule a formal conversation," the voice said, "at your convenience." "Of course," I replied. They asked if I needed representation. I smiled. I've had plenty of advice over the years. They gave me a date. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Not afraid, just reflective. I thought about the woman I had been when I first married Harold, how carefully I'd shaped myself to fit his life, how often I'd minimized my own instincts. And I realized something that made my chest ache. I had never been powerless. I had just been patient. The night before the meeting, Harold called again. This time, he didn't pretend. "Did you do this?" he asked. "Do what?" I replied. "You know exactly what I mean." I chose my words carefully. "I told the truth when asked," I said. "That's all." His voice rose. "You had no right." I waited. "You gave up everything," he continued. "You said you wanted nothing." "I wanted nothing from you," I corrected softly. That stopped him. Silence stretched between us. "You're ruining my life," he said finally. I closed my eyes. "No," I said. "You did that yourself." After we hung up, I felt something lift inside me, not triumph, release. For decades, Harold had defined the boundaries of our marriage, our finances, our future. Now, those boundaries were gone, and the truth, slow, methodical, unstoppable, was walking forward without me. When I went to bed that night, I slept without dreams, because whatever came next, I had already survived the hardest part. The building was taller than I expected, glass and steel, polished to reflect the sky, as if it were trying to look innocent by mirroring something pure. I stood outside for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting my coat, breathing slowly. 75 years old, divorced, living alone, walking into a place most people never see unless something has already gone wrong. I didn't feel afraid. I felt steady. Because when you've already lost the life you thought you were going to have, there isn't much left to threaten you with. The room they led me into was simple. No intimidation, no raised voices. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a glass of water placed carefully in front of me. They didn't rush. That told me everything. People who rush are trying to control outcomes. People who listen already know where things are headed. They asked me about my marriage, not in dramatic terms, not emotionally, chronologically, when accounts were opened, when responsibilities shifted, when decisions stopped, including me. I answered calmly, year by year, decision by decision. I didn't speculate, I didn't accuse, I described, and descriptions, when accurate, have weight. At one point, A man across the table leaned back slightly and folded his hands. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "did you ever question these arrangements?" "Yes," I replied. "And what happened?" "I was told not to worry," I said, "that it was being handled." "By whom?" "By my husband." They exchanged a glance. That glance wasn't victory, it was confirmation. When the meeting ended, they thanked me, not politely, sincerely. "You may be contacted again," one of them said. "I understand," I replied. As I walked out of the building, I realized something strange. For the first time in my adult life, my role was not to support someone else's narrative, it was simply to stand in the truth. Harold didn't call me that night, or the next. Instead, the silence spread outward. Friends stopped inviting him places, colleagues canceled lunches, advisors distanced themselves, not because they knew the full story, but because people sense risk long before they understand it. Our son called on the third day. "Dad's lawyer wants to talk to you," he said hesitantly. "No," I replied. A pause. "Mom, are you trying to hurt him?" I closed my eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I'm refusing to protect him. There's a difference." Harold finally showed up at my apartment again the following afternoon. This time he looked older, not just tired, exposed. He didn't wait to be invited in. "You planned this," he said flatly. I set my tea down and faced him. "I prepared for the truth," I said. "You planned to avoid it." "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." His hands clenched at his sides. "You let everyone think you were helpless." I tilted my head slightly. "You assumed I was. That distinction mattered." He paced the room, anger breaking through the fear. "Do you know what they're saying about me?" he snapped. "They're questioning everything." "That tends to happen," I said. He stopped in front of me. "You walked away with nothing," he said sharply. "You gave up your rights. I gave up claims," I corrected him. "Not facts." That landed, because he finally understood. This was never about divorce. It was about accountability. Later that week, the story shifted publicly, quietly at first. A delayed transaction, a postponed deal, a resignation framed as personal reasons, people whispered, and whispers have a way of growing teeth. Margaret visited me again. "They're no longer asking if," she said. "They're asking how far." I nodded. "And you?" she asked. "I'm fine." She studied me carefully. "You really are, aren't you?" "Yes," I said. "I finally am." The final call of the week came late Friday afternoon. It was Harold's attorney. Professional, controlled. He spoke carefully as if every word had been weighed in advance. "We'd like to revisit the divorce agreement," he said. I smiled. "I'm sure you would." "There may have been misunderstandings," he continued. "No," I replied calmly. "There were assumptions." Silence. "Mrs. Carter," he said finally, "are you willing to cooperate?" "I already have," I said, "fully," and that was the truth. That night, as I prepared for bed, I stood in front of the mirror for a long moment. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, not because she looked younger, but because she looked free. For decades I had been defined by what I gave up. I was defined by what I no longer carried. Harold had believed that by taking everything he would leave me with nothing. What he never understood was that nothing can be very light. And when you're no longer weighed down, you can stand exactly where the truth needs you to be. The first headline didn't mention my name. That was intentional. It spoke in careful language, words chosen by people trained to say everything without saying too much. Longtime financial advisor steps away amid internal review. No accusations, no conclusions, just enough smoke to make everyone start looking for fire. Harold called me an hour after it appeared. I didn't answer. For years I had been available on demand. Now I let the phone ring. That silence did more damage than any argument ever could. By the end of the week, the review was no longer internal. It had spilled outward, touching banks, firms, and institutions that preferred their names remain spotless. Harold's carefully constructed world, built on discretion and assumed loyalty, began distancing itself from him. Not because they suddenly doubted his integrity, but because doubt itself is contagious, and no one wants to be caught standing too close when it spreads. When he finally reached me, his voice was different again, not angry, not pleading, measured. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said. I leaned back in my chair, listening. "Doing what?" I asked. "Letting them tear everything apart," he replied. "We can fix this quietly," I smiled to myself. Men like Harold believe quiet fixes everything. "What would fixing it look like?" I asked, a pause. "I can take care of you," he said, "better than before." There it was, the old promise, the one that had kept me silent for decades. "I don't need to be taken care of," I replied. That unsettled him more than any accusation ever could. The formal notice arrived 3 days later. Harold didn't receive it at home. He received it at his office, in front of people. That detail mattered, because reputation isn't destroyed by facts alone. It's destroyed by visibility. I heard about it through our daughter, her voice shaking. "They were there," she said. "They asked questions in front of everyone." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry," I said gently. "Mom, did you know this would happen?" "Yes," I said. She didn't respond, not because she was angry, but because she was beginning to understand. Harold stopped going out, stopped making plans, stopped pretending. The man who once thrived on control now avoided contact, afraid that any interaction might become another thread someone could pull. And threads, once pulled, don't stop unraveling. One afternoon I received a thick envelope. This one was meant for me. Inside were documents summarizing findings, not conclusions, findings, patterns, inconsistencies, decisions made without disclosure. The language was precise, devastating in its restraint. I set the envelope aside and made myself tea, because by then I already knew the outcome. Harold came to see me again the following weekend. He looked smaller, not physically, internally. "I didn't think you'd let it go this far," he said. "I didn't push it," I replied. "I stepped out of the way." "That's worse," he muttered. He was right. "You destroyed me," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "No," I said. "I survived you." That distinction mattered more than anything else. The truth finally reached the children fully when legal counsel advised Harold to limit communication. That phrase alone told them everything. Suddenly, questions they'd never asked before surfaced. Why were accounts hidden? Why was Mom excluded? Why did everything depend on secrecy? Harold had no good answers, because secrecy only works when everyone agrees not to look. Margaret called later that night. "It's irreversible now," she said. "I know. How do you feel?" I thought about it. "Lighter," I said, and I meant it. The final blow didn't come from investigators. It came from institutions. Accounts frozen pending review. Privileges suspended. Access revoked. Harold had always believed power came from accumulation. He never considered how fragile access could be. That night, he called one last time. His voice was hoarse. "I never thought you'd be capable of this," he said. I closed my eyes. "I was always capable," I replied. "You just never noticed." We ended the call without saying goodbye. We didn't need to. As I lay in bed that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Certainty, not about what Harold would lose, but about what I had already gained. I had walked away with nothing, and in doing so, I had stepped into my own life. There is a moment in every reckoning when denial collapses, not loudly, not dramatically. It collapses quietly, like a building whose foundation has been eaten away for years. For Harold, that moment came when the invitations stopped. No more charity dinners, no more advisory boards, no more quiet lunches with people who once returned his calls within minutes. He had always measured his worth by proximity, who stood beside him, who needed him, who listened when he spoke. Now rooms went silent when he entered, and silence when shared by many becomes judgment. Our daughter called me one evening, her voice heavy. "I went to see Dad," she said. "He's different." I waited. He kept repeating the same things, she continued, that this would blow over, that people were overreacting. "And do you believe him?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "No," she said, "I don't." That single sentence told me everything. For the first time, she wasn't defending him, she was observing him. The story broke publicly the following week, still cautious, still restrained, but unmistakable. Questions about undisclosed financial arrangements, concerns regarding long-standing fiduciary practices, a resignation framed as necessary to preserve institutional integrity. Harold's name was no longer protected by vagueness. It was attached. He showed up at my apartment the next morning. No anger this time, no bluster, just exhaustion. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, sinking into the chair across from me. I studied him carefully. For decades I had believed this man defined my world. Now he couldn't define himself. You built yourself on secrecy, I said quietly. When secrecy ends, there's nothing left to hold you up. He looked at me, eyes red. I did everything for us. I shook my head. You did everything for control. He flinched, because deep down he knew it was true. That afternoon our son called. I've been going through old papers, he said, trying to understand. Understanding takes time, I replied. I don't know how we missed this, he said. You weren't supposed to see it, I said softly. That doesn't make it easier. No, I agreed. It rarely does. The children didn't choose sides. They chose clarity. They stopped defending Harold, stopped correcting others, stopped minimizing. That was the real loss for him, not money, not reputation, but the ability to be believed without question. The formal proceedings escalated soon after. Harold was required to appear not as an authority but as a subject. The power shift was complete. Margaret visited me again. You're remarkably calm, she said. I'm done being afraid, I replied. She smiled. That shows. Harold called me late that night. I should have trusted you, he said. I closed my eyes. No, I said gently. You should have respected me. There was a difference, and once seen, it can't be unseen. He asked me if I hated him. The question surprised me. No, I said honestly. I don't hate you. What do you feel? He asked. I thought carefully. Finished, I said. The next morning I read an article that referred to Harold as once influential. That word stung him more than any accusation ever could. Once, past tense. I sat by the window, watching the day unfold, and felt something settle inside me. For years, I had been invisible by force. Now, I was invisible by choice. And there is power in choosing when to be seen. There's a particular kind of desperation that appears when someone realizes the story they've told for years no longer belongs to them. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's revisionist. Harold didn't try to deny what was happening anymore. Instead, he tried to reshape what had already happened. He started calling people from the past, old friends, distant relatives, former colleagues who still answered out of habit more than loyalty. He told them a softer version of events, that he'd made mistakes, that he'd been misguided, that everything had been done with good intentions. Good intentions are the refuge of those who can no longer argue facts. He called me again one afternoon, his voice strangely calm. I've been thinking, he said, about us. I said nothing. I wasn't always like this, he continued. We were happy once. Yes, I replied, we were. I provided, he said quickly. I built a life. You built a structure, I corrected. I lived inside it. Silence. That wasn't the answer he wanted. The proceedings moved faster after that. Timelines were established, decisions examined, patterns traced back decades. What had once looked like isolated choices now formed a clear picture, not criminal in every sense, but unethical in enough. And that was sufficient. Harold's legal team advised him to cooperate fully. That word, fully, had never applied to him before. He had always given information selectively. Now selectivity was no longer an option. Our daughter came to see me one evening. She sat quietly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. I used to think you were just enduring, she said. I was, I replied, but I didn't realize how much you were seeing, she added. I smiled faintly. Endurance sharpens the eyes. She nodded slowly. I'm sorry, she said. That apology mattered more than she knew. Harold tried one final tactic. He offered reconciliation, not romantic, strategic. If we present a united front, he said over the phone, people will stop digging. I laughed softly. You still don't understand, I said. What? This isn't happening to you, I replied. It's happening because of you. He hung up without another word. The findings were finalized quietly. No spectacle, no courtroom drama, just consequences, loss of positions, restrictions, permanent notations that would follow him longer than his reputation ever had. For a man who lived on influence, that was devastating. I didn't attend any hearings. I didn't need to. My role had ended when the truth began moving on its own. One morning, I received a letter. Not from lawyers, from Harold. It was handwritten, short. He apologized, not for what he'd done, but for how things turned out. That told me everything. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as evidence, as closure. That afternoon I walked through a park near my apartment. Children laughed. Dogs pulled at their leashes. Life continued, unconcerned with the collapse of one man's illusions. I sat on a bench and felt something unfamiliar. Pride, not in what had happened, but in what I had survived without losing myself. Harold had believed I walked away with nothing, but standing there, breathing freely, I understood the truth. I had walked away with clarity, and clarity changes everything. When the noise finally stopped, I was surprised by what I missed. Not Harold, not the marriage, not the life we pretended was solid. I missed the tension. For so long my days had been shaped by anticipation, waiting for the next call, the next development, the next crack to appear. And then, suddenly, there were no more cracks left to watch. Everything that could fall had already fallen. The aftermath didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly. No apologies from institutions, no acknowledgments from the people who had looked the other way for years. Just an unspoken agreement to move on. That's how most truths end. Harold moved away, not far, but far enough to avoid recognition. He sold the house, the one I had once filled with laughter, dinners, small routines that felt insignificant at the time. It sold quickly, not because it was special, but because buyers don't feel the weight of memories that don't belong to them. Our children adjusted slowly. They stopped asking me how I was holding up. They started asking how I was living. That difference mattered. One evening, our son stayed late after dinner. "I've been thinking about something," he said. I waited. "You always seemed calm," he continued, "even when everything was falling apart." "I wasn't always calm," I replied, "but you were—" "Steady," he said. "How?" I smiled. "Because I stopped needing anyone else to believe me," I said. He nodded slowly. Harold tried once more to reach out. Not to negotiate, not to explain, just to be seen. I didn't respond. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They close naturally when you stop holding them open. I began rebuilding in small ways, not financially, internally, morning routines chosen by me, books read slowly, silences enjoyed instead of feared. At 75, I was finally learning how to inhabit my own life. Margaret visited one last time. "You did something rare," she said. "You let consequences speak instead of chasing justice." "Justice chased him," I replied. She smiled. The children stopped saying, "I can't believe he did that." They started saying, "I see it now. That was the final shift." Not blame. Recognition. I stood in my apartment one evening, watching the sunset spill across the walls. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who believed walking away meant losing. I understood now how wrong I had been. Walking away had been the beginning. People still ask me sometimes if I regret not taking more in the divorce. Money, property, security. I answer honestly, no, because I didn't lose anything that mattered. H.A. Rold had believed power came from possession, from accumulation, from control. I had learned something different. Power comes from release. When you give up what no longer belongs to you, you make room for what does, and what remained after everything fell away was me. I never expected anyone to understand what I had done. Not my children, not my friends, not Harold. Even I didn't fully understand it until that quiet morning, months after the divorce, when I realized something extraordinary. I had won without taking a single thing. The truth is rarely obvious. The victory we seek is often hidden behind years of patience, silence, and restraint. Harold believed he had taken everything. The house, the money, the life we had built together, all gone in his mind. He thought he had left me powerless. But power doesn't reside in what you own. Power resides in what cannot be taken. I spent the months following the divorce quietly rebuilding my life. I visited old friends I had lost touch with. I traveled slowly, savoring each place. I read books I had ignored for decades. I cooked meals I wanted to cook, not meals he demanded. I finally lived for myself, and in every action I was free. The final piece of the plan, though few ever understood it, was this: I had allowed Harold to believe he had won everything, because when a person overestimates their own security, they make mistakes, and mistakes are powerful. He had built a network of trusts, hidden accounts, and arrangements. Thinking no one would ever notice, he assumed I would sign the documents quietly and disappear forever. And for a moment, he was right. But I had watched, I had listened, I had documented, I had waited. And when the right moment came, the institutions that once obeyed him without question began to question him. Accounts were scrutinized, decisions were challenged, advisors distanced themselves, colleagues whispered. Even his own children began seeing clearly. Harold had believed he had controlled the narrative for decades. He hadn't realized the narrative was no longer his, and I hadn't needed to fight. I hadn't needed to scream, to threaten, or to accuse. I had simply existed quietly, patiently, and honestly. Truth, once released, moves faster than any argument. The final reckoning came not with a lawsuit, not with a courtroom, not with confrontation. It came with reality itself. Harold's world shrank, his influence waned, his story unraveled under the weight of the facts he had ignored for years. Meanwhile, I walked freely into the life I had built for myself, a life of peace, clarity, and dignity. My children came to me months later, not to ask questions, not to seek comfort, but to say quietly, "Mom, you were never helpless. We see it now." Those words carried more weight than any settlement could have. I had given him everything on paper. On paper, I was defeated. But in reality, I had already won. The house, the money, the so-called security, they had never been the prize. The real prize was freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from expectation. Freedom from manipulation. Freedom from a life dictated by someone else's ego. And that freedom, at 75, after decades of restraint, silence, endurance, was priceless. I sit now in my small apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor, tea in hand, and a smile on my face. I think of Harold occasionally, not with anger, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Because he never realized, in taking everything from me, he left me with the one thing that cannot be taken, myself. And that is everything,